October 24th, 1996.
The world was teetering on the brink of nuclear war, and John F. Kennedy was grappling with the most dangerous crisis of his presidency.
Which leaves me only one alternative, which is fire nuclear weapons, which is a hell of an alternative, and begin a nuclear exchange.
President John F. Kennedy and his closest advisors met in secret White House sessions to decide how to respond to Soviet missiles in Cuba.
The lesson is that the world came close to nuclear disaster. If there'd been a nuclear war, it wouldn't have been just the Soviets and the U.S. that were affected. You'd have had fallout affecting half the globe.
Tonight, the JFK tapes, inside the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
34 years ago exactly, President Kennedy, his brother Robert, Secretary of State Rusk, Secretary of Defense McNamara, and every other senior member of the nation's defense and intelligence establishment were gathered at the White House confronting the very real possibility of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. We had never come that close before. We have never come that close since. And now, for the first time, with the release of a new batch of audio tapes from the Kennedy Library, we are able to hear the actual voices of President Kennedy and his advisors as they grappled with what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The missiles in question were actually Soviet intermediate-range weapons that had the potential of wiping out most of the East Coast and a good portion of the Midwest of the United States. To this day, it is not altogether clear why the Soviets took the risk of provoking nuclear war with this country. But the leadership gathered at the White House had what it believed to be irrefutable proof, based on photographs taken by American U-2 spy planes, that the missiles were in Cuba. The dilemma confronting President Kennedy and his advisors was how to get the Russians to withdraw those missiles, or failing that, how the United States could neutralize them. Here's the way President Kennedy evaluated the problem.
So I must say, I think it's a very satisfactory position from their point of view. If you take the view that what really, and thirdly, if we do nothing, then they'll have these missiles, and they'll be able to say, anytime we ever try to do anything about Cuba, they'll fire these missiles. So that I think it's dangerous, but rather satisfactory from their point of view. If you take the view really that what's basic to them is Berlin, and there isn't any doubt in every conversation we have with the Russians, that's what even last night we talked about Cuba for a while, and Berlin is it. So actually that it's a quite bizarre situation from their point of view. Now, that's what makes our problem so difficult. If we go in and take them out on a quick airstrike, we neutralize the danger to the United States of these missiles being used, and we prevent a situation from arising, at least within Cuba, where the Cubans themselves are the means of exercising some degree of authority in this hemisphere. On the other hand, we increase the chance greatly, as I think there's bound to be a reprisal from the Soviet Union, there always is. They're just going in and taking Berlin by force some point, which leaves me only one alternative, which is fire nuclear weapons, which is a hell of an alternative.
One of the participants in that meeting was then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Earlier this evening, I summarized for him the excerpt you just heard. Here he is fairly early on in the crisis, and he's evaluating the crisis. And he is saying, on the one hand, if we leave those missiles there, that gives the Soviets a tremendous advantage that they wouldn't otherwise have. But if we try to take them out by force, it's almost inevitable that the Soviets are going to respond in Berlin. So already he was confronting the possibility of nuclear war with the Soviets.
He was confronting it, but not in the sense that your audience may interpret the word confront. He was determined to try to avoid it. Not all of his associates believed that would be possible or perhaps even desirable. But certainly he was determined to try to avoid it, as, in effect, I was as well. It wasn't at all clear to him how he could do that. That was the dilemma that he was putting forward.
As you will hear when we come back, Secretary McNamara's recollection is quite vivid, particularly his memory of the most hawkish member of the Joint Chiefs, Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by AT&T.
If you're ready to do business on the internet, and you're wondering where to start, then the fastest growing internet provider in America invites you to get on board. Now, no matter what size your business is, AT&T makes it easy to catch the wave.
We made a name for ourselves by inventing a wonder drug. And now, we're improving the diagnosis and treatment of major diseases. Our energy-absorbing foams make cars safer than ever. And our crop protectants help farmers produce a more abundant food supply.
So much good we can do for each other. Oh, what a world it can be.
Bayer. In healthcare, chemicals, and imaging technologies, we cure more headaches than you think.
If you drive, don't miss this. Anti-lock brakes. If you know how to use them, they could save your life. If not, watch out. 2020, Friday on ABC.
Steve shares Tennessee's values. Bart Gordon shares Washington's values. Steve knows what it's like to raise a family, what it's like to work all day and come home in the evening and those little arms are ready to wrap around you and play. Bart Gordon's wrong about Steve Gill. Steve knows how hard it is to earn a living. Bart's up in Washington has raised our taxes 40 times. My family means everything to me. Bart, you've told a lot of stories about my family that just aren't true. I know it, and you know it too.
Does the truth matter?
Now, I will tell you this. I will not raise taxes on the middle class.
He gives us the largest tax increase in American history.
The era of big government is over.
He gives us a massive government-run healthcare system.
Everybody knows that I have tougher ethics rules than any previous president.
More investigations, more prosecutions, more convictions. And the list goes on and on. Does the truth matter? Does it matter to you?
What General George Patton was to tank warfare during the Second World War, General Curtis LeMay had been to the Strategic Air Command. He was one of the most highly decorated and admired generals in the U.S. military, but he was a warrior, not a statesman. In years to come, he would recommend bombing North Vietnam back into the Stone Age. And in October of 1962, as President Kennedy weighed the dangers of attacking Cuba to destroy Soviet nuclear missiles there, LeMay, then Air Force Chief of Staff, had nothing but disdain for talk of a naval blockade and political solutions. Nor did he think that the Soviets would respond to a U.S. attack on Cuba with their own attack on Berlin.
I don't share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they're going to knock off Berlin. We've got the Berlin problem staring us face anyway. If we don't do anything to Cuba, then they're going to push on Berlin and push real hard because they got us on the run. If we take military action against Cuba, then I think that...
What do you think their reply would be?
I don't think they're going to make any reply. No, if we tell them that the Berlin situation is just like it's always been, if they make a move, we're going to fight. I don't think it changes the Berlin situation at all, except we've got to make one more statement on it. So I see no other solution. This blockade and political action I see leading into war. I don't see other solution to it. This is almost as bad as appeasement of duty. But I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
Let me say a word about LeMay. It may be hard for you and your audience to understand this, but I served under LeMay as a junior officer in World War II. He was without any question the greatest combat commander I met in 3 years of service in any one of the military services. And he was also perhaps the most miscast policymaker, military policymaker as Chief of the Air Staff. And LeMay believed, when he was Chief of the Air Staff, one of the Joint Chiefs, He believed, without any question, that at some time the U.S. and the Soviet Union were going to have to fight a nuclear war. And it was far better, in his opinion, to do it when we had a vast superiority in numbers. We had roughly 5,000 strategic warheads, nuclear warheads, in October 1962. We thought the Soviets had 300. We had a 17-to-1 numerical advantage. I think we probably exaggerated the 300, maybe it was 150. In any event, LeMay thought it was much better to fight under those circumstances than, as it later became 20 years later, we had roughly the same number. President Kennedy felt, and I felt, that, my God, so they only had 300 or 150 perhaps. One of those would destroy 100,000 Americans, kill 100,000 Americans, 1 million Americans? Is that what a U.S. president should decide to do? No way. So there was a basic conflict in the minds of LeMay on the one hand, who really believed that we'd better fight then than later.
There was no question, because our not satellite photography, the U-2 photography had demonstrated, I think, to U.S. intelligence satisfaction that there were missiles, intermediate range missiles in Cuba.
You're right on underlining the word missiles.
But did we know whether those missiles had nuclear warheads?
No. Obviously they were there for the purpose of mating them with nuclear warheads. The question was, since we had the photographs of the missiles, were the warheads there as well?
What did you think at the time?
And the CIA at the time believed they probably, and I would emphasize the word probably were not there. They thought that 20 were coming on a ship, as I recall, named the Poltava, but that it hadn't yet docked, and this was one of the reasons the blockade was to stop all vessels carrying military equipment. But the CIA believed they weren't there, but they couldn't certify they weren't there. And later, and perhaps we can have a moment to talk about this later in the program, later we learned there were far more than anybody had any conception of there on the ground. That we didn't know.
You told me earlier on when we were talking that you later learned, and maybe you'd like to tell me now how you learned it, that there were at least 162.
If you can imagine, it's 30 years after the peak of the crisis. That is to say, in October and November 1992, there were published in Moscow 2 reports that stated there were 162 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba at this critical moment that Kennedy is worrying about this problem, and LeMay is, in a sense, pushing for military action. And of the 162, my God, there were something on the order of 90 that were tactical nuclear warheads designed to be used against a U.S. invasion. And we had no knowledge of that at all.
And you were planning an invasion at the time. I mean,
a U.S. air attack, which those who were recommending it were candid enough to say would have to be followed almost surely by a land and sea invasion, was being planned. The first day airstrike was planned at 1,080 sorties, a huge airstrike. The invasion force, 180,000 men, had been assembled with the associated vessels in southeastern U.S. ports. It was to be commanded by Admiral Dennison, who was commander-in-chief of all NATO Atlantic forces at the time. He was to command this invasion force. He had sent a cable to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and to me, and he had said, I, Dennison, believe that the Soviets may have tactical nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba, and therefore I request your authority to equip our U.S. invasion force with tactical nuclear warheads. I talked to the president about it. We said, no way would we ever permit anything like that. So, had the invasion taken place, and on the dates you're talking about, Saturday, October 27, the majority of Kennedy's military and civilian advisors would have recommended that on Monday, the invasion take place. Had that taken place, you would have had U.S. forces without nuclear weapons confronting a Soviet force with them. How would it have ended? An utter disaster.
General LeMay, as Mr. McNamara just indicated, was not alone among President Kennedy's advisors in pushing for a military solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though that would very likely have led to nuclear war. When we come back, you'll hear President Kennedy talking about just such a war and about the few options for civil defense that would have been available to citizens of the United States.
Preserving the money you've made over the years is a never-ending war of attrition. All the forces of man and nature will conspire against you and chip steadily away at everything you've worked for. Your best defense is vigilance. Your best ally is a trusted financial consultant. Hire one with a passion for the work. It could make all the difference.
Smith Barney. They make money the old-fashioned way. They earn it.
I heard someone say, what will they think of next? And I thought, how wonderful it is to imagine that someone is out there thinking of things. And that's their job, to think of something that no one has ever thought of. And all we have to do is wait and wonder, what will they think of next?
The Chrysler Cirrus, Concorde, and LHS, bringing what's next from the cab-forward engineering of Chrysler.
Tomorrow, immigration, where the candidates stand, GMA's guide to the issues, plus former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev.
That's tomorrow
on Good Morning America.
I looked over the horizon and discovered the new world.
There is a revolution beginning in Tennessee public schools.
I emailed my friends in Stockholm.
Brought by a partnership of Nashville Chamber of Businesses, the state school system, and Vanderbilt University.
In that very first meeting, they said, get yourself a dream.
A virtual school for teachers, tuition-free, that prepares them to guide their students into the new technological age.
Bernoulli's principle.
The equipment was donated, so was the expertise. The result is remarkable.
The guy from the Space and Rocket Center gave me some very cool ideas on airfoil design.
This revolution in education can't succeed without the support of the business community. You and your business can help in any of 42 such programs by joining Vanderbilt Partnerships in Education.
What did you do in school today, honey?
I learned how to fly.
I want you to meet my #1 advisor on Social Security and Medicare. She's a real expert. Nothing like a home-cooked meal. Hey, Mom. How you doing?
Good.
Believe me, I understand the need to keep on protecting Social Security and Medicare, for keeping them strong, for our seniors' peace of mind. And believe me, I got the best reason in the world for doing it.
You sure do, son.
I sure do.
Again, we're listening to tapes made in October of 1962 at the White House, as President Kennedy and his top advisors deliberated on how to deal with Soviet missiles that had been secretly brought onto the island of Cuba. One concern, as you've heard, was that a U.S. military attack against Cuba might provoke the Soviets into attacking Berlin. Back in the early 60s, that would have led to a full-scale nuclear war. But another concern, only slightly less ominous, was that an attack on Cuba might result in the launching of those intermediate-range nuclear weapons from Cuba onto the continental United States, just 90 miles away. That and the obvious consequences were very much on President Kennedy's mind.
It seems to me the most likely problem we're going to have in the next 10 days is if we decide to invade Cuba, they may fire these weapons, or at least we got the assumption some of them may be fired. Now, what is it we could do in this arc to evacuate these communities so that, after all, the people living out in the country, we can take care of them to the extent it's possible. We get radiation by various steps, then we got the problem of blast. Can we, say, before we invade, evacuate these cities?
Well, if we knew that there would be no nuclear response, it might make some sense. But there's pretty fallout. The only protection that exists today is in the cities, and there's little or no protection in the rural areas.
Robert McNamara, who was President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, was one of the key advisors in those White House meetings. It sounds as though when President Kennedy talked about the possibility, the prospect of nuclear warheads landing on the United States, that there really wasn't a whole lot that anyone could have done about it. I mean, in terms of saving lives. He talks about the possible evacuation of cities. Would that have been realistic?
Certainly not. There was talk about using civil defense. And somebody said, well, we could take care of, I think they said 40 million people in bunkers, but they weren't stocked. But what about the other 50 million? And the basic point that was in President Kennedy's mind, which was not as clearly seen by many others, was that it is the president's responsibility to avoid risking even 100,000 U.S. lives. And a more likely total of even 1 or 2 missiles getting through would have been 1 million or so. And it was his determination to avoid that shaped a lot of his discussion and behavior in those very critical last days.
During those critical 13 days in October of 1962, the specter of nuclear war hung over everything, which was why, when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev hinted at a possible compromise solution, President Kennedy was inclined to move in that direction. American Jupiter missiles were deployed along Turkey's border with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev wanted them out. In reality, the missiles were old and all but obsolete.
Well, now, that's what we ought to be thinking about. We're going to be in an insupportable position on this matter if this becomes his proposal. In the first place, last year tried to get the missiles out of there because they're not militarily useful. Number one. Number two, it's going to any man, the United Nations, or any other rational man, will look like a very fair trade. I think you're going to have it very difficult to explain why we are going to take hostile military action in Cuba against these sites, which is what we're thinking about. The same when he's saying, if you get yours out of Turkey, we'll get ours out of Cuba. I think you've got a very touchy point here.
What was at issue, as Secretary McNamara told me this evening, was not so much the Jupiter missiles themselves, but how Turkey and America's NATO allies would react to the appearance of Washington removing those missiles under pressure from Moscow.
The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were obsolete. The president knew that. I knew it. Others knew it. As a matter of fact, the president some months before had said to the State Department, these are obsolete missiles, let's get them out of Turkey. So you had this tension. In a sense, Kennedy, on Saturday the 27th, the day before Khrushchev finally stated publicly he was taking out, Kennedy said over and over again, I don't want to take this nation to war over a pile of junk. On the other hand, the opposition was saying, but Mr. President, you don't understand. Nobody will credit a U.S. security guarantee if we appear to be trading our security for the Turks' security or NATO security. We take those Jupiters out of Turkey and we will appear to be weakening the defense of Turkey and weakening the defense of NATO in our own interest.
And yet by April of '63, 6 months later, the missiles were withdrawn.
Well, we agreed that the missiles in Turkey were junk. We were going to replace the land-based missiles with Polaris missiles at sea, and therefore we're going to take them out unilaterally, secretly. And I said, Mr. President, I'll get them out, I'll get them to Italy, I'll cut them up, I'll have photographs taken and deliver them to you. And he said, therefore, Bobby, you go tell Dobrynin that we are going to take those out. That's not part of the deal. It's a unilateral decision. If you, the Soviets, ever mention it, we'll put them back. It wasn't mentioned for 8 to 10 years.
In a sense, that strikes me as having been an enormous public relations victory, both in terms of the pressure that it did not put on the Turks and on NATO, and also in terms of the perception that the American public had that we were eyeball to eyeball and the other guy just blinked.
Well, at the time, the president said, I don't want any one of you to say it was a victory. I don't want any one of you to say it. We came very close to ultimate disaster. Let's remember that. And none of us did declare it a victory. And I don't even want to declare it a victory today, because I think the lesson is that the world came close to nuclear disaster. If there'd been a nuclear war, it wouldn't have been just the Soviets and the U.S. that were affected. You'd have had fallout affecting half the globe. So the world avoided a nuclear war, and at the end, it avoided a nuclear war because both Khrushchev and Kennedy were very sensitive to their responsibilities to do that.
And that ultimately is how the crisis was defused. But Robert McNamara is convinced that there are lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis that haven't been fully absorbed to this day. We'll hear what he has to say on that subject when we come back.
Someone figured out together we have 115 years working on Fords. This is my great-grandfather in 1907. He worked in the original Ford plant. In 1925, my grandfather drove a Model T across the whole country. When he got back, he started working at Ford and built the Model A. He always says that this is what my grandmother really fell in love with. And you know, Grandma never denies it. My dad, he crafted the metal for the Lincoln. I knew someday I'd work for Ford. Today, I'm an engineer on the Mercury Sable and the Ford Taurus. Growing up, I was taught whatever I put my hand to must be done with the highest quality. After all, it has to live up to the family name.
How far can MasterCard take you? Here in Australia, MasterCard takes you into the future. The new MasterCard Cash Card. A MasterCard you can use just like cash. It's happening right now down under, and it's on its way here.
The 4:58 a.m. is usually deserted, except Fridays there's a crowd.
How are you? Good. Friday's free? You bet.
There's small business customers who've switched to Sprint and get long distance on Fridays free, even calling cards and faxes.
How about these free Fridays?
Works for me.
And they get low flat rates the rest of the week to stay competitive. So don't get left behind. Help your business do more business with Fridays free. Call 1-800-598-5000. Call Sprint Business.
Sunday. Get down! Harrison Ford in one of Tom Clancy's most powerful thrillers.
I'm after the man who tried to kill my family.
When terrorists followed him to America, it was political.
Let's do it.
When they went after his family, it became personal.
You get him, Jack.
Harrison Ford and an all-star cast. Ann Archer, James Earl Jones, and Samuel L. Jackson.
I will destroy you.
Patriot Games, Sunday on ABC. Parental discretion advised.
What lessons can we, should we, must we perhaps draw from the occurrences of October of 1962 today? What is still relevant today?
The important point is that human beings are fallible. We all make mistakes. The common conventional wisdom is don't make the same mistake twice. You know, we make the same mistake twice, but don't do it third and fourth time, you learn. There's never going to be a learning curve with respect to nuclear weapons. You make a mistake with respect to the launch of nuclear weapons, and you're going to destroy nations. And therefore, I think it's becoming recognized by many of those who have had the responsibility to consider whether we should actually launch. The indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear weapons is going to lead to disaster to our nation. And therefore, there is more and more the belief we must eliminate these. Now, that is not by any means a majority view today, but just 2 months ago, the Canberra Commission recommended unequivocally that the 5 declared nuclear powers should eliminate nuclear weapons. Andy Goodpaster, the former Supreme Allied Commander, former military assistant President Eisenhower, came to the same conclusion. I think you'll see in the next 3 to 5 years widespread debate on this subject. I hope there is.
Mr. McNamara, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you,
You've
sir.
been very gracious to come in.
Thank you.
And that's our report for tonight. Tomorrow on Good Morning America, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on the political volatility in today's Russia. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
A man's dedication to career.
Your father's packing his stuff. His flight's tomorrow.
Tears his family apart.
You are leaving your son! Don't have any other option.
But despite the pain,
Just talk to me.
I can't forgive him for being who he is. A son struggles to keep the hope alive.
I'm not gonna just walk away.
All New Relativity, Saturday.
My daughter Polly was only 12 years old. She had her whole life in front of her. But a criminal who shouldn't have been out on parole kidnapped her and took it all away. President Clinton forced Congress to pass his tough crime bill, life in prison for dangerous repeat offenders, and expanded death penalty. I hear people question the president's character and integrity. It's just politics. When it came to protecting children, the president had the courage to make a difference.